Okay, I'm going to use an illustration to explain. And if you can get this illustration, I really think that you can understand what took me years to figure out in seminary.
Okay, stop. I think I can explain classical apologetics in about 3 minutes using an illustration that anyone can understand. And I'm gonna do it from my hometown of Solana Beach, California. Ah yes, Solana Beach in the winter. Lots of blue sky and blue water. A perfect place to talk about classical apologetics. Let's listen in.
It turns out there's not just one apologetic, but there's many different kinds of apologetics. And they're all ways of defending the Christian faith. Now each one has a different approach on how they do that. And the approach I'm going to talk about today is called classical apologetics.
Okay, so let's imagine this bubble is classical apologetics. And inside of it, you have 2 more bubbles. The first bubble is rational apologetics. And the second is evidential apologetics. These 2 bubbles are the 2 steps of classical apologetics. If we could learn what each of these steps are, we'd have a pretty good grasp of what classical apologetics is. So let's take a look at the first bubble called rational apologetics.
A person uses rational apologetics when they try to prove that God exists using logic, reason, or philosophy. So let's put these words in the bubble. Here's logic, reason, and philosophy. And the arguments in rational apologetics are usually put in what's called formal proofs. So let's also put that in there too. Now, what do I mean by arguments? If you've ever heard of the cosmological argument for God, or the ontological or moral or teleological arguments for God, this is what I'm talking about.
Let's look at an example. Here's a cosmological argument for God. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe had a cause. The idea is there must be an originating cause of the universe, and this must be God. One more example. Here's a moral argument for God. Moral law implies a moral lawgiver. There is an objective moral law. Therefore, there is an objective moral lawgiver. The idea is that this moral lawgiver is God.
There are many different kinds of arguments like this, and you really need to carefully think through each premise to see how they arrive at their conclusion. It involves a lot of using your mind, concentrating, thinking through logic and whether the arguments are sound, that kind of thing. This is why these kinds of arguments are called rational arguments for God. And this is why the first bubble is called rational apologetics. The second bubble is evidentialism. And this is the second step for classical apologetics. And the second step is proving Jesus' resurrection, along with his life, death, and burial. Now it does this by looking at historical evidence, archaeological evidence, evidence from fulfilled prophecy, that kind of thing. So we can fill in this bubble with things like history, archaeology, Bible accuracy, prophecy. A really good example of evidentialism, I think, is Lee Strobel's book and movie called The Case for Christ. It's his personal story about how he tried to disprove Christianity as a reporter. But the evidence actually led him to become a Christian instead.
The Gospels are filled with contradictions.
The empty tomb is based on evidence. Do you really want to know the truth, or is your mind already made up?
So that's basically classical apologetics. The first step is to prove that God exists using rational apologetics, and the second step is to prove Jesus' resurrection through the evidence.
That's the 3-minute explanation right there. But if you want to know some more advanced thoughts, stick around.
There's a few more ways that we can look at these 2 different bubbles. Let's talk about that next.
Since rational apologetics is basically reason,
It's okay just to call it that. So we can call it reason, and the second bubble we can call evidence. So this might be an easier way to think of classical apologetics. It's half arguments from reason and half from evidence. Classical apologetics says we should use reason and evidence to try to prove Christianity, even to unbelievers. But not all apologetics teach this. In fact, some say that because of the fall, people are too corrupt to come to the truth through reason and evidence. So this is one way that classical apologetics stands out, because it says that these are both good and both should be used. A second way we can label these bubbles is deduction and induction. Deduction is when you start with an axiom or premise and move to particulars. This is what philosophers usually do. Induction is when you start with particulars and move to a conclusion. This is what scientists do. So classical apologetics uses arguments from deduction, or philosophy, and arguments from induction, or science. It uses both. And the last way we can label these bubbles is with some Latin words, a priori and a posteriori. A priori is what we can know before experience. It's just using our minds before we go out and observe the outside world. A posteriori is what we know after experience, after we observe the outside world. Now, if you've studied philosophy, you know that there's been a raging debate between these two philosophical schools of thought. But classical apologetics says that both are useful. Now, I know that this last part was really deep, but if you get everything I just said, you're well on your way to understanding what the big deal is about this apologetic approach. Now remember, it's 2 steps. Basically, 2 different apologetics added together to make a third, much bigger apologetic. Finally, this was the highest ranking apologetic on my survey for what keeps a person convinced Christianity's true. It came in towards the top for 57% of those surveyed. In other words, more than half of those surveyed continue to believe Christianity's true by the arguments from classical apologetics. So this is what makes this apologetic approach a very important topic to know about and to study.